Hi everyone, my name's Stella and I'm going to be discussing the Transformation Era, which took place from 1870 to 1944. When we think about this era, the first thing that comes to mind is the aftermath of the Civil War. Many call it the Reconstruction Era. While the slaves were legally free, the South created Jim Crow laws which kept former slaves and descendants legally segregated. In the North, slaves were free, but their economic opportunity wasn't better. And while abolitionists called for equal opportunity for African Americans, they were cold when it came to Native Americans. World War I, World War II, the Great Depression also occurred during the Transformation Era. We also see the Roaring Twenties, in which prohibition and the suffrage movement began as well as industrialization. Better farming equipment came and enhanced the yield of product and eventually increased exports. With industrialization also came the expansion of the railroad. We also see an increase in foreign exports and domestic market. Businessmen became the most powerful men in the nation during this era, growing in political and economic power, and I'm talking about the railroad owners, meat packers, oil producers, and more. But there was a financial crisis in 1873 and 1907, which was caused by speculation and unregulated capitalism. This caused the government to regulate more things by introducing different laws. Such as the Interstate Commerce Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Pure Food Act, the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Trade Commission. We also are introduced to the 16th Amendment, which introduced the income tax. And this leads to the expansion of philanthropic foundations, which become useful in supporting research in several other areas in higher education. At the beginning of the era, few students attended college despite the population growth, and graduate schools weren't formed yet. Only 9,000 bachelor degrees were awarded a year and 0 doctoral degrees were awarded, but this all changed after 1870. The student population grew from 63,000 to 1.5 million, faculty grew from 5,500 to 150,000, 135,000 bachelor's degrees were awarded, and 3,300 doctoral degrees were awarded towards the end. This era saw many big changes. It was the largest growth of enrollment in the last 35 years. The number of colleges quintupled and enrollment increased by several thousand%. During this era, we see the emergence of the university, an institution complete with an undergraduate college, professional school, and graduate department. Research begins becoming more prominent. This was heavily influenced by German institutions. The Association of American Universities was established in 1900, and the institutions that made it were the institutions that set the standards. AAU had a list of bachelor degrees from institutions that they deemed were worthy of proceeding to a graduate degree. This created competition among universities. More and more universities sought after the prestige and to grow large in size. Weaker institutions were made into junior colleges, but these junior colleges were successful and prepared students for entry into the university level. Private colleges for children of freed slave families, were established. Only a few became prominent and the others unaccredited. But after the Second Morrill Act, which would deny any state's appropriation if they didn't allow, if they denied admissions based off race, unless they created a separate but equal facilities, public-supported colleges for African Americans received a boost. We also see that more women's colleges emerged in this era, and many of these women's colleges adopted the same traditions from the institutions that were already established. Enrollment increased and was the greatest during the 1920s. More women began enrolling. What used to be a 1-to-5 ratio for female to male increased to a 2-to-5 ratio. The number of high school graduates increased between 1920 and 1930, which contributed to the growth in enrollment. Many people sought degrees to move between social classes. The admissions requirement also put academic merit first, but admissions officers would overlook the fact of less qualified candidate if their parents were alum or were wealthy. English hadn't been a requirement at the beginning of the era, but as English became more pronounced, English composition started becoming a requirement for some schools like Princeton in 1870 and Harvard in 1874. Some schools required knowledge of other subjects for admittance, such as Cornell requiring knowledge of physiology in 1877. Schools began adding letters of reference, personal data, and aspirations into the admissions packets in 1920 through 1930, but still prioritized um, alumni parents and intellectual qualifications. This was a way for institutions to limit enrollment because of lack of facilities and resources. They also used race, religion, gender, ethnicity, family wealth, or social standings as a way to screen for admissions. Standardized tests were created, such as the SATs or the GRE, to make admissions more selective. Student life really became something. Resident facilities needed to expand because of the introduction of women on campus as well as the increase in enrollment. Campus activities expanded and grew to intercollegiate activities where athletics and debates formed between other schools. Athletics actually received their own budget and college stadiums started getting built. Students became involved in social issues such as the suffrage movement and communist movements. At the beginning of the era, professors spent less time in the classroom. They were only expected to spend a short time teaching a variety of subjects, but that evolved to the faculty being knowledgeable in a particular academic discipline with a commitment to long-term full-time employment. College presidents could hire and fire, paying only as much as necessary to attract staff they considered qualified. Research really became an integral part of the American university, and with that came the emergence of the sabbatical leave from Harvard around 1880. This allowed professors to engage in further study and remain in their current field. Academic departments formed around the 1890s due to these specialized fields, and this came from the German influence. Another German influence was having professors choose what they wanted to study and teach, and having students choose their own studies. Administrators weren't really fond of this academic freedom since faculty might try to spread unpopular ideas. The American Association of University Professors were established in 1915 to give faculty rights. With it emerged the idea of faculty tenure. Interinstitutional disciplinary associations formed, and allowed faculty to have colleagues outside of their own institution. We also see the ranking of faculty emerge from the latter half of the 19th century. From assistant professor to associate professor to full professor, and by the end of the era, enrollment of faculty had increased with more than 85 instructors employed at each institution. The curriculum had expanded to where faculty were able to teach what they wanted and students could take whatever class they wanted. The curriculum became more specialized and differed between each institution. A bachelor's degree in any specialized area was readily available, so you could get a BS in microbiology or a BA in hospitality management, like what we have now. Increase of students graduating who went on to college. Requirements for admission to college shifted as degrees expanded. A few institutions required admissions tests. Attention turned to public schools, which caused institutions to rely on high schools to change their curriculum to prepare the students for college. We see an increase of students graduating who went on to college, with 41% of students admitted came from a public high school, 40% from preparatory schools, and 17% from private preparatory schools. The elective system was established, but there was no clear enforcement of standards. Students who went to the same college, entered the same year, and pursued the same degree could have gone the whole time without being in the same class as each other. Colleges began a core curriculum where students needed to take courses so they could have a breadth of knowledge, such as humanities, science, social science, mathematics, and fine arts. Colleges asserted that they did more than teach courses, but gave students life. They taught them culture, helped mold their character, and provided them with tradition and more. Discussion groups became more prominent than lecture-based instruction, which was an imitation of the German university seminars. Libraries opened for longer hours. Class size grew to accommodate the increased enrollment. We see standardized textbooks and exams, written examinations with standardized questions becoming the norm, instructors giving out grade marks as opposed to written statements to students. Courses began having credit hours, which made it possible to transfer between different colleges. Some institutions tested courses via the radio in the 1920s, which is where we first see evidence of the higher education adapting to technological advances. The Carnegie Foundation was established, and the American Council on Education was also established to set expectations for accreditation of colleges. The church influence declined in private institutions. Accrediting and professional associations determined the faculty-student ratio, lab size, and staff qualifications. Faculty had more power at institutions and were actually in charge of hiring the curriculum as well as degree requirements. Trustees, who were appointed by the governor in public colleges and universities, were in charge of institutional maintenance, while administrators were essentially business managers. And the trustees also appointed the president. This era is when we see the introduction of the strong presidents of post-secondary institutions. Many of these presidents were selected based off their managerial skills versus their expertise in a specific academic area. Some presidents had the task of expanding schools to contain professional and graduate schools. The best presidents had great managerial skills, were both compromisers and autocrats, strong leaders and innovators. They had to create new schools from the bottom with a limited budget and faculty. We see a rise of academic departments, or we see a rise of administrative bureaucracies, and new departments were created to support the office of the president, with deans over academic departments. Academic departments were more democratic, where they had equal voting rights and rotation, and there was a rotation in department heads. Academic senates were formed, which allowed faculty to have more influence within the institution. Student affairs was developed, and the student personnel point of view was published in 1937, which was the first document to recognize the need to consider the student as a whole. Private grants and state funds provided some influence on institutions, as well as accrediting associations started establishing standards for library holdings, classroom, lab size, programs, degrees, and other areas. Institutional accreditation formed so other institutions and agencies could figure out how valuable a degree was. This became a prerequisite for licenses and other occupations. Student government was developed at most institutions. They didn't have any power, but they were influential over extracurriculars, and this affected curricular directions and staff appointments. In the Transformation era, we see the rise of philanthropy, and this is due to the emergence of the income tax that I spoke about before. Private donations was an important source of revenue. As income and inheritance taxes grew, foundations became more prominent. John D. Rockefeller donated $30 million to University of Chicago. Others, such as Carnegie, Vassar, Vanderbilt contributed substantial amounts of money to institutions that now bear their names. For most colleges, funding came in smaller increments, and donations were made for distinct purposes such as scholarships for students, books for the library. They also received funds from fundraising, as well as endowments and appropriations. Princeton relied on their well-developed networks of alumni and asked them to contribute to the school. With the rich getting richer, this allowed for greater state appropriations. There was a building boom, especially for labs, libraries, and athletic facilities, which attracted more students and donors. With the Great Depression, higher education suffered, but not as much as most. Some of the outcomes that we saw in this era were the community pride continued. Towns actually fought each other to become the new place where an institution would be built. Colleges made contributions to the war by actually serving as military training centers. The ROTC was established in 1916. SATC was in 1918. Research in natural sciences grew rapidly, we also prepared individuals for various professions and assist students to enter society. We really are focusing on the well-rounded student in this era, and colleges and universities had a substantial effect on the nation's economy in this era. This is the reference that I used. Thank you so much, and I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation.